So we see all these things that are promoted in the name of inclusivity, of immigration, of diversity, and then we see the actual outcomes. And the actual outcomes, I think, are themselves the best argument against this mentality.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of truth to what you just said there. I think, especially when you look at how maybe the Muslims see themselves, and I'm sure it might be the same in America. I'm sure it is in America. The idea that they might not even see themselves as American, or they might not see themselves as British.
That seems problematic, yeah.
Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show.
Well, hey there, folks. Brian Nichols here on another fun-filled episode, of The Brian Nichols Show. I am, as always, your humble host, joining you from our lovely Cardio Miracle Studios here in sunny Eastern Indiana. The Brian Nichols Show is powered by, the best heart health supplement in the world, Cardio Miracle. If you want to learn how to lower your resting heart rate, lower your blood pressure while improving your pump at the gym, stick around. We're going to talk about that more later in today's episode. But first, today we're taking a hop, skip, and a jump across the Atlantic Ocean. And we're talking all things UK politics, immigration, culture, and more. Joining me here on the show to discuss that from the UK is Daniel Fessahaye. Daniel, welcome to the Brian Nichols Show. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me, Brian. Yes.
Great to have you on. Yeah, for sure. I got the last name right?
Perfect. You got it.
I know. I was only stressing about it for 5 minutes before we hit record. But Daniel, thank you so much for joining, man. Really looking forward to the conversation. Do us a favor before we dig into the meat and potatoes today. Go ahead and introduce yourself here to the Brian Nichols Show audience and why you're focused on what's happening in the UK, specifically from a culture, immigration, and more standpoint.
Great. Yeah. So as you've correctly said, I'm from the UK, London to be specific. My name is Daniel Fessahaye, financial journalist, mainly specializing in markets, cryptocurrency, personal finance. I dabble in AI, but more recently in crime, as this piece is about crime. Basically what I wrote about in the critic was on the back of some stats that were released that showed that mobile phones in 2024 in terms of thefts, it's gone up by 40% in the previous year. It's gone up to 70,000, over 70,000, which equates to about 192 thefts per day and about one every 7 minutes. So it's gone up quite a bit. And essentially what I argue in the piece is that London has become sort of a cesspit of crime, and that we must combat that phone theft with more tougher policing, harsher sentences, and I suppose increased stop and search, and more sort of police patrolling. So, yeah.
So obviously your article is focusing on the increase in crime, right? Both violent crime and what others would consider non-violent crime, but crime is crime in my book. So let's talk about that, right? How did the UK get to this point? Because I think a lot of Americans specifically think of more of these first world countries like the UK, France, Sweden, all these countries we've kind of grown to know and love over the years as being same church, different pew to America. But y'all are having a lot of these issues, and it seems to be hitting all at once. So where did these issues come from? And I guess, what's the real impact on the average citizen there?
Yeah, I think so. It's been going on for a while. And as you correctly stated, most, I suppose, people would assume sort of first world country, more civility, Western world, Western country in the Western world, just more decorum. But no, that's the opposite. In London, I think really it stems from just police being soft, essentially. Don't really want to sort of rock the boat. I think the idea that stop and search has been seen as through a racial lens in the UK, London specifically. London, big demographic in terms of ethnic minorities. So it's stop and search has mainly been seen as sort of through a racial lens, which has meant that the police are a bit more sort of cautious, not wanting to really sort of delve into that, and if you have a less stop and search, then there's going to be more crime as a result, and that has led to what we have now: increased theft in terms of mobile phones, in terms of shoplifting, and all sorts really, whether it's violent or non-violent.
We had this in the 90s, specifically in cities like New York City. Mayor Giuliani had passed, basically the same verbiage. Instead of stop and search, it was stop and frisk, right? That was the approach. And we did see a direct correlation to those policies being implemented and a drop in crime. However, a lot of civil rights organizations, to your point, rose up their concerns that this was disproportionately going after minorities, specifically Black Americans in New York City. But I guess then the question comes to, Daniel, right? Like, is there actually some truth though behind the policies? Not so much in terms of targeting individual groups of people, but just by and large that these are the types of groups of people we see doing these types of crimes. Therefore, it's not so much a target against a specific group of people, but rather just, sorry, your group of people tend to be doing more of the crimes, or is there something else?
I think there's some truth to that. I think I would sort of put it down to mainly, I suppose, class, really. In terms of the certain areas you go to, the more impoverished areas tend to have more ethnic minorities. And in doing so, if you go to an area that has the demographic tends to be more ethnic minority and they're more sort of impoverished, then you are to see sort of rising crime. And, if you increase the stop and search, then the likelihood is you will get sort of that demographic in terms of committed sort of that are the ones committing more crime. There is some truth to that. And I think London, as you sort of said, in New York in the 90s, you could compare it to that, an ex-great city, I suppose, a beacon of the Western world, once sought after, sort of morally decaying through poor policy, through sort of wokeism, for lack of a better term, and really just focusing on different areas. So, for instance, our mayor, Sadiq Khan now, he was knighted a few days ago, and it's quite controversially by the king. And it seems like he has a different agenda for London, really sort of delving into certain other aspects, just strange sort of focus he has. And you can really compare sort of London to New York in the 90s. Even San Francisco, obviously bits different because it's sort of drug rampant. We do have a bit here, but not as much as San Francisco, obviously. So it's a bit of a combination, I would say, mainly to your class, but it does link to what you're saying as well.
So you said your mayor, he has some different priorities. What are those priorities in your opinion?
Well, it's quite clear to see that, the mayor is focusing more on, things, hot button, like sort of cultural war sort of issues in terms of really delving into the woke side. He was one of the people, if you remember, that was heavily against, in his first term, President Trump coming over. He's the president of the US, commander-in-chief, and just, sort of one of the most important people in the world. And he was against him even visiting as president in 2016. So he does know how to sort of play up to his base, I suppose. And he's, he cries also all the time about sort of Islamophobia and all this stuff that he's experienced. And he even recently renamed a bunch of stations, overground stations in London, just after strange names, just sort of harping on about different stuff about Windrush and just the station names were just a bit odd. He's really focused on sort of, I suppose, good PR on his left in the left wing base. And he sort of plays up also because he's of Muslim heritage, classifies as a Muslim, so he plays up to that sort of side of it as well.
Well, and just, digging into some of these numbers you talked about, talking about his appeasement of more of a Muslim type of a demographic. I get it, I guess, right? Because when you look between 2011 and 2021, the UK's Muslim population has increased by 44%. And I mean, we hear that number. That's striking. I mean, you go from, it was in 2011, approximately 1.01 million Muslims in London, which were 12.4% of the city's population. In 2021, or that number went up to 1.4 million, which, I mean, that is a drastic increase. So when you see that increase of 40 to 45% in just 10 years, right? I understand how there seems to be an appeasement of that group of folks who are coming into the country. But if you're a new parent, you already know the feeling. Running on maybe 3 hours of sleep, chasing your kid before the coffee kicks in, it's like you're constantly in survival mode. And even if you do find time to eat clean or sneak in a workout, your body's just not operating at full speed. Stress, sleepless nights, and poor nutrition tank your nitric oxide levels, leaving you sluggish, foggy, and unfortunately snapping at the people you love the most. And trust me, I've been there. That's why I started using Cardio Miracle. That's a clean nitric oxide blend that supports energy, circulation, and mood with no caffeine crashes or stimulants. Just ingredients like organic beetroot, CoQ10, and L-arginine that naturally help you stay present, productive, and powered through parenthood. Trust me, this stuff helps you show up for your family. So, scan the little QR code over my shoulder, click the link in the show notes, or simply head to cardiomiracle.com/TBNS to give it a try. And by the way, when you go to cardiomiracle.com/TBNS, you're going to get a discount automatically applied at checkout. Just look for the little note saying you're shopping with Brian Nichols at the Cardio Miracle homepage. One more time, that's cardiomiracle.com/TBNS. And now, let's get back to the show. It very much is at the expense of the existing citizens, the existing population. And we're seeing that not just in London, we're seeing this firsthand in America, as we had literally tens of millions of illegal aliens flood the border, the southern border, over a 4-year period during the Biden administration. So I say that, Daniel, when we look at where your mayor, in this case, has been trying to appease a more, I'd say, yes, a woke base, but obviously a much more specific base, in this case, based on religion and nationality. I mean, what's been the feedback from your average Londoner, your average citizen in the UK? Like, is this being embraced, or is there people fighting back?
There are, I suppose, people fighting back, but I would say by and large, it has been embraced. It's just seen as...
Really?
Yeah, it's just seen as just something where, times have changed rather. And so, for instance, if you go to East London, large pockets of East London are mainly sort of Muslim immigrants based there, in sort of Tower, Hamlets, that sort of area. Further on along, Whitechapel, Mile End, that sort of area. But to be fair to the mayor, he does get a lot of fight back from, actually, funny enough, the irony of the sort of Muslims in London, because he does adopt a lot of work policies. I mean, he's very, very, he pushes a lot of sort of the trans rights, sort of the sort of LGBT, I suppose, sort of rights in terms of actually pushing that sort of agenda. So there are actually quite a few Muslims that do sort of fight back against him. But the main problem, sort of deviating from that for a second, in London, as seen actually under him, is that theft has risen by 33% in 2014 under the mayor from the previous year. While the national theft rose only 3% in that span. So you can clearly see that London is, rising. The theft is rising at an extremely high rate. And yeah, I think there's many reasons for that, but I think a lot of it is to do with a lack of priority. As you may have seen recently, as your audience may know, but during the sort of Southport riots in the last summer, there was a woman, Lucy Connolly, that was sentenced for a tweet. And I'll just preface this by saying it was an abhorrent tweet. There's no denying that, but to be sentenced for 31 months, I think it was, for a single tweet, just shows, I think, where the priority lies for those in charge.
Well, and I guess, as I was scrolling through before we had hopped on here today and I'm doing some research, I'm seeing these articles from the BBC, from CBC, and just they're going through talking about not the actual crimes that are being committed and then folks reacting to, but rather, and pardon the expression, but it almost feels like a gaslighting, Daniel, of saying, well, these crimes that are being committed against Muslim folks, these targeted attacks, they're just coming out of nowhere. They're in a bubble, and it's not taking into consideration the very things we're talking about today, the increase in crime. And then there's the unspoken piece, right? And that is the change in culture. And we go to look at those numbers again, the increase, 40 some odd % of an increase in the Muslim population in less than 10 years. That is a very large change in the culture. And I'm just going to say, the Muslim culture and the traditional United Kingdom, English London culture, they're not exactly going hand in hand. So this kind of does feel like we're getting into a war of the worlds kind of mentality as well. Like when worlds are colliding, and London is becoming more or less the testing ground for this. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to what you're saying. I think especially because the UK, like the US, but in the UK it's a bit more, I suppose, official, was very, is very much built on, Judeo-Christian values, right through the Magna Carta to the way we govern, Parliament, the Lords, the Commons. So there is a very, there's a sort of Christian sort of lens that you have to look through the UK in, even though I suppose as we speak, recent studies have actually showed that Christianity has become a minority religion for the first time. And obviously, the Muslims that are coming over, or that are born here, second generation, third generation, would obviously, not embrace, I suppose, those Christian values. Or if they do, then it would be going against, obviously, what they believe in terms of their religion. So there is some friction that I believe not many people want to speak about. So you're quite right in that respect.
Well, and really quick, Daniel, let's laser focus on that, because does that part right there, the I don't want to speak about it because it's, we're starting to dabble into the world of PC culture. Is this politically correct? Am I going to get canceled for this? Is that leading into why, to your original point earlier, that so many folks are just either not speaking out or tacitly going along with the change?
I suppose, I think, to be frank, I suppose most people just see, mainly it's usually the white liberals, they mainly see as Islam being able to coexist in society, and sort of the way it has to, so essentially people have to change rather than the people as in existing in the country have to change.
So people have to embrace, the uptick in crime. They have to embrace their society crumbling and not feeling comfortable walking through western parts of London. That's the mentality people have?
I suppose, but to be fair to what we're discussing today, the rise in crime, you cannot point it, in terms of theft anyway, mobile theft, you cannot exclusively put that down to Muslims. There's other sort of things you could maybe discuss, but just generally
like what speaking, though? I'm just curious. What other things by chance?
I suppose, what's going on? What have we seen in terms of in Rotherham, for instance, in terms of sort of the rape scandals? Many white working class girls that were raped over extended period of time, that was covered up really.
But wasn't it also by the Muslims?
Yeah, no, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
oh, okay.
So that would be something you can definitely look into. But in terms of the actual mobile sort of thefts, that obviously, you could not put it down to Muslims.
And the reason I'm asking these clarifying questions, Daniel, because we see this a lot in America, where the more progressive white liberal, to your point, they like to walk and chew gum at the same time. And not in the way that, or I guess not, that's not a good expression. They like to have their cake and eat it too. There we go. That's more fitting for our conversation today, because when you look at this mentality of I'm going to use the term open borders very loosely. I'm speaking culturally speaking, but from a policy perspective, we did see that here in America for 4+ years. But this open borders, complete like melting pot assimilation mindset, that is what's promoted. And then when we see these other cultures, you see these other communities come into America, there is zero drive or effort to actually incentivize the assimilation. What we end up seeing is this narrative of, oh my goodness, America, e pluribus unum, one from one many, right? And then we are a melting pot. We're assimilating all these different values and cultures together, and that's what makes America great. And what we're seeing from an outcome standpoint is actually we end up with very, very like segmented communities that are based around their own specific cultures. They're not integrating. They're not embracing American values and traditions. And to your point earlier, what you're seeing with the Muslim, the Muslim perspective on certain issues, not exactly meshing with the Judeo-Christian values of the traditional citizen in London or in the UK. We're seeing that here in America, and it's very much coming to a head. The left, though, they will say, well, we need to embrace this because of diversity, because of equality and inclusivity. But the average person seeing this, Daniel, and they're saying like, dude, time out. Like, not only are you starting to bring more people in that are destroying our culture and not trying to assimilate, but in the same point in time, now they're taking from our resources. They're taking from the welfare system. They're now going into our public schools and paying very little when it comes to taxes. From a net taxpayer standpoint, they're not contributing. So we see all these things that are promoted in the name of inclusivity, of immigration, of diversity, and then we see the actual outcomes. And the actual outcomes, I think, are themselves the best argument against this mentality. Running a small business means adapting on the fly. Hiring, scaling down, shifting teams based on seasonal projects. But most phone systems, they lock you into a set number of users and then make it a pain to adjust. And on the contrary, that's where Level 365 shines. Add or remove users anytime. Month-to-month plans, scale up when you need it, scale down when you don't. It's flexibility that actually matches how your business works. No headaches, no overpaying for empty seats. Just phones that move with you, and that is what makes Level 365 different.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you just said there. I think especially when you look at how maybe the Muslims see themselves, and I'm sure it might be the same in America, or I'm sure it is in America. The idea that they might not even see themselves as American, or they might not see themselves as British.
That seems problematic, yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of all they see, for instance, because there is that sort of clash, I suppose, in terms of what America and Britain traditionally has stood for, sort of the Judeo-Christian values, compared to obviously what they, in terms of what sort of Islam and Muslims see themselves as, in terms of what they worship and what their values are. There definitely is some sort of, there's definitely a disconnect with that. But I suppose for it to work, obviously you need less people as, over a longer stretch of time, but also you need to be sort of firm in terms of what the country stands for. I think the problem you have is that when you do allow for, a vast amount of immigrants to come over, you do have to be clear in terms of what the country stands for, as opposed to just saying, like you said, a melting pot, the idea that everyone brings, sort of their baggage, I suppose, like a better term, and that we can just sort of figure it out together. And I think once you do that, then you've lost your country. So,
well, and that requires us to say some very tough, unpopular truths, right? Like, No, not all cultures are created equal. I'm sorry. I don't think you should be embracing a culture that says you can marry literal children to grown adults. And that shouldn't be controversial. That shouldn't be like, oh, well, Brian, that's just a different culture's perspective. Like, no, there are definitive moral good and bads. And I think this is where we really saw the traditional like 21st century mentality of how we need to approach culture. Again, much more from this leftist, progressive, white liberal mindset of, we just got to kumbaya, hug everybody and say, we're all in this together. It doesn't work. And as a matter of fact, it is causing more issues. And we're seeing, again, right now in America, the racial, ethnic tensions are at, I would say, one of the highest points I've seen in my adult lifetime, because we have seen so many folks just tacitly embrace or downright excuse away quite crappy behavior in the name of, well, they don't know better. This is how their culture is. And the average person saying, I don't care. I don't care what their culture is, because their culture, whatever it may be, is polar opposite to my culture. And guess what? Whether this mentality is right or wrong, I was here first and I'm going to fight back. And this is the part right here, the fighting back, where I think people are really, they're ready to go to blows, because they don't want to see the culture that they have embraced for literally generations at this point, living here in the continental United States, living over in London or in the UK. They don't want to see it just disappear in some morally, very vague, political correct narrative. And I guess, I'm concerned, Daniel, because I'm guessing we're going to see the vocal fighting back turn into a physical fighting back. And at what end does that stop? And that's where my concern really is right now.
No. And I think that should concern everyone. I think, especially if it does get to a stage where there is violence, then that is a cause for concern. But to touch on your point in terms of, especially if we link it back to London, which is obviously what I'm more familiar with, born and raised here, just recently, there was a man who basically was found guilty of a religiously aggravated public order offence in the UK. Who basically, because he burned the Quran, and that happened in like I said, that happened in Knightsbridge, I believe, in London, and he was sort of fined, and I just don't understand how we've got to a place, especially in the Western world, where that is classified as a crime. I mean, that's basically a blasphemy law, really. So I think stuff like that needs to be rooted out, and that needs to be called out, because as sort of the start of we were talking about in terms of the start of this sort of podcast, there are other crimes that are not being dealt with, like mobile thefts. So if we're sort of looking at different crimes, for instance, like the burning of the Quran, and sort of prosecuting people on the basis of that, then we really come to a place where is free speech,
Well, and Daniel, like this right here, like I think this is where your average person is, right? You just outlined it perfectly. They see, okay, wait, if I'm in London and I burn a Quran, or God forbid, I say something inflammatory on Facebook, that I'm going to get arrested. But we have groups of Muslim men going out and quite literally, sexually assaulting little girls. And you see real violent crime, people's property being stolen, and that's not being addressed. Your average person says, oh, now what? Right? Now what? What other tools in a polite society do I have to try and maintain some type of order? And they're watching firsthand as the criminal justice system is failing them. It's punishing people for speaking out about their very real concerns, and it's enabling people who, first of all, culturally are opposite of the actual Londoners that these laws were built to protect, now using these laws and against the average person, and actually not going after real violent crime. Like, if I'm a Londoner and I see that, what other tools are in my tool belt?
No, I think, you you've outlined it actually pretty well in terms of the sentiment of, I suppose, the average Londoner. But going back to the earlier point, I think we're at a place where even the average Londoner is scared to say what you've just said, or for because Islam is seen as a religion of minorities, or just in terms of it's seen as still foreign, even though it's been around since the 7th century. It's still seen as something that is other than the US or the UK. It's still seen through a racial lens, for instance. So if you are, if you insult a Muslim, for instance, then there might be cause of racism, even though you can technically, and using their sort of language here, you can technically be white, a Muslim. But I don't think they would say racism there. So then there is obviously there is that sort of hypocrisy. But I think people are scared to call it out. But we do need to get to a stage. Unfortunately, to be fair to the average Muslim in London and in the UK, especially the ones that are born here, they would be against all these things we're talking about. They would be against marrying children. They would be against blasphemy laws. They would be against a lot of these things that we in the Western world would sort of, have a sickly feeling about. I think the problem may lie in, especially those who don't call it out, those who maybe are a bit more prominent, and really it's to do with the MPs we have. Because a lot of them really do walk on eggshells, not wanting to upset them, because it is seen as a race rather than a religion.
Because I hear all this, right? And I guess I empathize with your average Londoner, but I'm like, at what point are y'all gonna you actually stand up and whatever way this would look, but fight back? Because I think back to what we've seen over here in America, and with the reemergence of Donald Trump here in 2024, and we've seen a very big cultural shift more towards the political right over the past year, especially because more folks started to vocally stand up and speak out and say, no, I'm not going to tolerate this. I'm not going to tolerate as millions of illegal aliens are flooding my border. I'm not going to tolerate as my government arbitrarily decides who is and is not considered essential during a pandemic, and then arbitrarily shutting down businesses. To take a step further, we're not going to accept the government's deciding that, no, you can't go to your place of worship to worship on a Sunday because there's more than 5 people, right? And we saw more and more folks not just think this, but start to vocalize this, very much understanding the very real concerns. Like, dude, I can't get monetized on YouTube 4 years later because I was one of the more vocal critics fighting out vocally against the COVID tyranny. And I'm still paying for that this day. I see, my Facebook pages, they were nuked for years. Like, I had 0 engagement, and that was very real dollars and cents that I sacrificed to go out and actually talk about the issues that people needed to hear about, bringing people on the show that we're talking about, like the actual truth of the science, stuff that we are now looking and saying, yep, that was accurate, that was factually true, but was silenced during the pandemic. And it was the fact that so many people were vocally willing to speak out and take the slings and arrows that got us to where now we have RFK Jr. in our Health and Human Services, Jay Bhattacharya, who is one of the most vocal proponents against the COVID insanity, actually promoting the Great Barrington Declaration, which was a complete polar opposite approach for the government's response to the COVID pandemic, saying maybe we shouldn't just arbitrarily lock down societies, but rather let it be local communities deciding for themselves what the best courses of action were. Because believe it or not, we're not all one size fits all, especially here in the States. Like, now all these people like Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the head of the National Institute of Health, that's old Anthony Fauci's role, right? Dr. Fauci. Like, we see now these very vocal proponents back during the insanity who were ostracized, taking positions of power and authority, and actually helping bring things back to some common sense. So I say all that, Daniel, where's your folks out there who are willing to stand up despite the unpopularity, right? Despite this, this fear, I guess is the best word to use, this fear of societal ostracization, fear of being called, nasty, dirty words, right? Like, who are the folks besides Tommy Robinson who are over there actually willing to speak out and speak up against this insanity?
Good question. We don't have many, especially those that are sort of, I suppose, people would recognize worldwide. I think we do have, for instance, actually, he's made waves in the US over the last few years, but Douglas Murray is someone who's been beating the drum about this for many, many years. He even released a terrific book, The Strange Death of Europe, where he looked into sort of Islam, identity, culture. And yeah, there are certain people that are willing to discuss this. But as you outlined with Tommy Robinson, a colorful figure, but it does come with consequences. I think what the big difference between the US and the UK, other than the sort of demographic difference in terms of Muslims in the US, as in per capita, in terms of if you look at the sort of population as a whole of the US, is obviously free speech. So you outlined all these different things and why you should sort of go against these things, but we do not have something we can rely upon as a sort of First Amendment. We don't have that, and because of that, some may argue, we're not as free as America, and as a result, it does mean that we do have to be a bit more sort of careful in the way we articulate certain things.
Well, Daniel, I was just going to say, hey, there's a reason we fought a revolution in 1776, man.
Right.
I'm just saying.
Right. No. I totally get that. And you do see cases of what some may argue are two-tier policing. For instance, I give you the example of the man that burned the Quran. But if we look on the other side of it, there was a woman, a Christian, I believe, who was praying, is in Birmingham, I believe, and she was praying in her head, so silently, near an abortion sort of center, and she was arrested as a result. So it was a thought crime. I mean, it's not even a crime anyway to pray, but rather she wasn't even doing that out loud. Of course, there's buffer zones that they believe, so they do not sort of infringe upon the woman who is deliberating on whether she should have the abortion or what have you. But if you're doing it in your head, away from the abortion center, I may add, then it does beg questions of why do such a thing? And I think the police in this country are petrified of certain groups, as you've already outlined. And so what they do is they go a bit harder on the so-called easier targets to sort of flex their muscles. It's almost like a bully picking on someone not their own size. And that's the state of London we see. And sadly, as a result, it's seen as an ex-great city. And we've seen millionaires flood. And there's a millionaire exodus currently happening in London. I believe since 2014, we've had tens of thousands of millionaires leave. And that's hurting our economy as a result. I may add that a lot of that does also have to do with tax reasons. A lot of them are going to Dubai. But, as seen as there's one example of a famous boxer in this country, Amir Khan, you may know. But he was robbed for his watch in London. And his wife was heavily pregnant at the time. And as a result, he blamed Khan and sort of the policies and how he's not sort of tackling crime. And as a result, now he lives in Dubai, sort of carefree. He can wear 15 watches at once, and nothing will happen as a result. And that's sadly the sort of where we are in London.
Yep. Well, and there's two things, right? Dubai, the noted white Christian city or a country, right? No, what? And yet there is an embrace of values, right? And I just want to make sure I paint this picture very clear. Just because we're talking about the Muslims today does not mean we're classifying all Muslims in this case, but rather specific cultural focuses of these groups, right? And this is a perfect example. You see a traditionally white society like London versus a traditionally more, ethnically Muslim, browner country like Dubai. very different, and yet Dubai is safer. Dubai is more business friendly, and Dubai is flourishing. Whereas the UK has embraced this very backwards mentality, this woke cultural politics, and it is destroying the country. And you mentioned the millionaires flooding to Dubai. Who can blame them, right? Because the writing's on the wall. It's only a matter of time if the trends continue in the direction they've been going. I mean, we talked about it today, 44% increase in the Muslim population in a 10-year span, right? Okay, so what happens in a democracy when the Muslim population or just the minority populations overarching take over the overall voting demographics that now they control the government? It's not a matter of these police officers or politicians being afraid. It's that now they're going to be doing what they're told to do by this new group of folks. And listen, like, argue for folks listening who are like, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, fine. But then don't pretend that, well, all these people who are moving to Dubai or who are vocally opposing this insanity are bad people, right? They're not. They're seeing the writing on the wall of what's happening to their communities. And by the way, this is exactly why we've seen such a resurgence here in more of a right thinking mentality in America, because this exact playbook was being enacted pretty much from like 2014 onwards. And we saw this, from the end of the Obama administration, the attacks against Trump and the DEI, the DEI, the ESG, environmental, social, and governance types of mentality taking over the private world, the academic world. And then in 2024, it was just a complete reversion, right? A complete rejection of that narrative and ideology. And a lot of folks in America, myself included, feel that, hey, even if we're not necessarily like winning right now, we're at least on the right, we're on the right path. We're going the right direction. So I say all that, like, Daniel, as we wrap things up today, what would be your call to action to the folks who are in London? They're scared, right? The cops who, to your point, they're petrified. Like, what is a course of action that could be taken today? Is there a course of action? And if so, what does that look like? And by the way, if there is no legitimate call to action right now, I don't want to make you go on record saying, it's time to, 1776 this, but like, is there a moment when the average person in the UK has to just kind of look around and start addressing some very difficult truths?
Yeah, I think sort of my call to action would be sort of what I outlined at the beginning, especially if we just want to look at crime specifically and rather focus on the increase in theft that we've seen. As I spoke about, just earlier about millionaires leaving, the research actually from the Adam Smith Institute here in London actually found that equates to about just over 390,000 in income tax. So it's a big number, and it's hurting our pockets. So I think in terms of even just looking at financially, we have to be, I think, tougher on policing. There was one incident I wrote in the article that there was an individual who in one morning stole 24 mobile phones, and he was only given 2 years. And probably with good behavior, I mean, that would be reduced even further. So we need to be tougher on crime, harsher sentences, and increased stop and search. But we also need more police presence patrolling the streets, because I think psychologically that would make a bit of a difference. I would argue with anyone on that. You see a few officers on the road just walking around, it would make the criminal think twice. So I think those are the things we can do. I think are quite easy. And we can do straight away. More longer term, we do have to have the question that I suppose we've sort of dissected in podcasts in terms of our values and what we stand for. What do we want to be seen as? Do we want to be seen as a nation that doesn't stand for anything and that just allows all different cultures, even if they contradict one another, to just sort of mesh and sort of see what happens? Do we want to do that? Or rather, do we want to actually stand on our sort of Judeo-Christian values, our ethics, and really beat that drum? And that might actually require us to actually look into what we really stand for, and how we can actually sort of implement that in our everyday lives for it to be a reality.
Well, if you guys need any, any like starting off points, I have these documents. They're called the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. So I'll send those your way, Daniel, and make sure you share them with the folks who need to see it, because we found it works pretty good here, even when we face some very, very like tough realities, some tough truths, and tough situations. Those, even though they're not perfect, right? There are absolutely flaws in our American system. We have issues here. I'm not pretending we don't, but hey, at the end of the day, we seem to be doing something decently right, because even when the proverbial crap hits the fan, we seem to be able to fight back in some way, shape, or form. So I'll make sure I send those copies over to you. No, I'm just teasing, Daniel. Do this as we're wrapping things up here today. Give the audience a quick final thoughts. Wrap this episode up in a nice, neat bow. And of course, where can folks go ahead and reach out to you if they want to continue the conversation today?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, we need to be sort of tougher on crime, and we need to really, I think for the US audience, I just hope I've given you a bit of a flavor of what London is really like currently, as someone who's born and raised and lives here currently. It is, seen as a place where criminals can sort of go around, and do what they like, really, depending on sort of how they look like. And just hopefully things change. Sort of pray about it, but also to, we just hope maybe folks, in America sort of can call upon you right now, and that you can help us with this fight. In terms of where you can find me probably on X at Daniel Fessahaye. That's mainly where I sort of, publish my work and sort of around there.
Good stuff. All right, Daniel, we'll include all those links in the show notes, by the way, for folks to go ahead, follow you if they want to continue that conversation. And by the way, folks, if you got some value from today's conversation, I know you did, make sure you go ahead and give today's conversation a share. I know we have found, and this will be my final thoughts, right? We have found more often than not that lots and lots of folks over the past 15 years, especially in America, have been afraid to talk about some uncomfortable truths, very much like what you're talking about, where the general sentiment was and is over in the UK. And Daniel, what really changed it, going back to what we were talking about earlier, was starting with some folks just speaking up, right? Talking about the stuff that we need to talk about and saying some uncomfortable truths. I look at, what you're doing today, folks like Tommy Robinson, who are going around, and more, who I think, love them or hate them. There's value to being able to have conversations that are uncomfortable. And if you're not able to have those conversations because of fear, because of social ostracization, whatever it may be, that speaks more of the society versus the actual ideas themselves. So we'll go ahead. We'll put a pin in today's conversation. Daniel, I really, really, really enjoyed today's conversation. And folks, hopefully you did as well. So with that being said, Brian Nichols signing off here on The Brian Nichols Show for Daniel Fessahaye. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.